Thanks so much, Roy. Can I just say it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in a space that I think centres the importance, and I've heard it several times already, having only been logged on for 15, 20 minutes, centres the voices of those who are most likely to be affected by the pandemic and whose voices are often actually marginalised the most in our national conversation. Not just about the pandemic, but also about the economy and politics in general. I just want to say to anyone who is interested in these issues, particularly around the intersections between economic policy, austerity, the pandemic, and the disabled people's movement, that I've just done an episode of my podcast last week with the wonderful Ellen Clifford of DPAC, Disabled People Against the Cuts, just looking at the kind of long-term impact that austerity has had on disabled people in the UK, and the kind of general position of disabled people in capitalism, and the importance of the disabled people's movement for the left and for the socialist movement more broadly. I would really encourage everyone to listen to that show with Ellen and to pick up her book as well if you're interested in that side of things, because I struggle to think of a time where it's become clearer how central the struggle of disabled people is to the struggle against capitalism as it is right now. I always remember that Tony Benn quote. He was talking about refugees, and again, it's not coincidence that refugees and disabled people have been perhaps the two groups most just oppressed by this government. That it's instructive the way that the government treats refugees, because it shows how they would treat everyone else if they could get away with it. And I think you could say the same about disabled people. I think centering those voices in our movement and in our struggle is really, really important. I'm going to come on to how we do that a little bit more later, but I just kind of want to talk a little bit more about the kind of macro side of things and the macro economy and the impact that the pandemic is having on basically the structure of capitalism. And I know it can be a bit jarring going from that level of the kind of, big structural stuff that's happening with, macroeconomic policy and with the corporate environment and all that sort of stuff. But it is really, really important to understand, I think, the way that capitalism is adapting and that capital is adapting to the situation that we find ourselves in today, because it really does set the terrain within which we have to understand our struggle, our struggle against capital, and for the construction of a system that actually treats human life with some level of dignity, unlike the one that we find ourselves living in today. So I think we have to broadly understand the effects of the pandemic as well. I mean, understanding the effects of any crisis, I think it's often useful to, especially when you're in the midst of it, to think about the response of most capitalist institutions, whether you're thinking about firms, about the state, financial institutions that exist at the level of the world system, to understand what happens during crisis through this lens of centralization. And the reason I think this is important during capitalist crises in general, and this crisis in particular, is because crises of capitalism often take the form of kind of collective action problems. So there's lots of different capitalist enterprises, all of whom have an interest in there being a resolution to a crisis that stems from, say, I don't know, a kind of financial crisis that involves an over-leveraged financial sector, or a crisis of overproduction, in which one sector of the economy has produced too much to be absorbed in the rest of the economy. All of these kinds of crises involve a failure to kind of coordinate between different sectors of capital, between different capitals themselves, and therefore often take the form of these issues around, how do we organize capital more effectively to be able to combat these problems. And the response often, usually, therefore leads to greater levels of centralization. You saw this in the financial crisis, for example, where we had this, extremely significant challenge of the fact that some financial institutions were effectively insolvent, and yet some financial institutions knew that they themselves were probably going to be able just about to get through this crisis, so they didn't want to rely on the state because they thought that would make them look weak. But if certain institutions were to take support from the state, then that would have made them look weak relative to their competitors. There needed to be this kind of central force pushing all of these institutions to take some form of bailout, to take some form of state support. And that is indeed what ended up solving the crisis, was the state intervening, basically getting a lot of the time all the bankers in a room and saying, you're going to get this, you're going to get that. So this kind of process of centralization, where you see the kind of anarchy of the market momentarily contained within this system, where it seems as though we have this a much more kind of coherent level of what we might call kind of planning taking place, at the apex of the capitalist state and of this kind of monopolistic system that we have of competition within the rest of the economy. And today, I think we see that process of centralization on steroids, basically. And there are very, very obvious reasons for that. It's, and I think we can look at that process of centralization at the level of a number of different institutions. But I think the point I want to come back to, and the reason that I framed it in this way, is that often when you see centralization of capitalism during a crisis, it's easy to look at that and think, oh, this looks like socialism. And that may be because the state has decided it's going to intervene more in the economy. It may be because large monopolistic institutions are doing what looks like planning. It may be because we look like, for a moment, we're living in a system that's governed by principles of cooperation rather than competition. But actually, I want to talk a little bit today about how this process of centralization deepens many of the problems and contradictions of the system that we're living in, and actually ends up being experienced and manifesting itself as a centralization of power that is used by the ruling class as a collective. And remember, we have to view the ruling class as this collective. We can't separate out the state and see that as something that's good versus individual capitals and they're something that's bad. We have to look at the ruling class as a whole. Indeed, that's part of understanding capitalism as a whole system. That the centralization of power at the very, very apex of society, at the top of these very, very powerful institutions, is not something that should be welcomed, even when it comes in the form of what we're seeing today, which is a Conservative Party that says, oh, we're very comfortable with spending more in the economy. Because ultimately that power is going to be centralized at the top, and it's going to be used by the ruling class against working people. And that's that real tension that is created by this process of centralization, because it's centralizing power, wealth in the hands of a very small elite that then finds it somewhat easier to use that power against working people. Now, of course, that process creates all sorts of contradictions in and of itself, and we can talk about that perhaps a little bit later. But I think that is the real important point to understand about the kind of crisis that we're living through today. We're seeing a centralization of capitalism, and occasionally that makes it look like we're not actually living in a system that resembles the kind of neoliberal capitalism of the last 30 or 40 years. But in reality, what we're seeing is a deepening and a strengthening of the power of the ruling class rather than a weakening of it. And I think that you can look at this through the lens of how it's affecting various different institutions. And I particularly, so in my book, The Corona Crash, I look at how this centralization is affecting 4 different sets of kind of institutional systems, I suppose you could call them. So firstly, we've got a massive increase in monopoly power amongst corporations, amongst big businesses. Secondly, you have a deepening of the logic of financialisation, so a growth of the power of financial institutions within that sphere of capital. And then when it comes to the state, you've got a much greater role, well, let's say a much more transparent role for the state in the economy, not necessarily a more extensive role, because one of the big kind of lies of neoliberalism was that it involved less state action in the economy, when in fact it involved a reorientation of state power away from serving some interests and towards serving others. And then finally, we're seeing this take place at the level of the capitalist world system, with a massive centralization of power in the global north compared to states in the global south. So I'll take each of these in turn very briefly, and do stop me if I go on for too long, because I sometimes lose track of time. But no, so when it comes to the centralization of capitalism, as it pertains to big business, we are seeing just a massive increase in monopoly power as the pandemic goes on. And Marx actually talked about this in Capital. This always happens during crises, because capital, when lost in some hands is then concentrated, when lost by many, many hands, is then concentrated in a small number of hands. And, you know, this is basically taking place as small businesses go under, small and medium-sized businesses go under, and their assets are bought up by larger corporations. But also because capital as a whole is kind of flooding into the biggest, safest enterprises, you know, businesses like Amazon, Tesla, these big tech companies that are seen as the kind of future of capitalism. And that is really concentrating the power of a small number of firms against, a perhaps more kind of diverse ecosystem of firms that we had prior to the crisis. Although, you know, even then, we've been seeing a process of centralization and of market concentration that's been deepening for many, many years now. So the kind of economy that we're going to end up with when we leave this crisis is going to be much, much more centralized. It's going to be much more monopoly power. And I think that's something that we probably haven't quite gotten our heads around yet, is just how much the power of big businesses, not just like Amazon, but also, you know, the big kind of the big food conglomerates, the big manufacturing organizations. Most of our economy is highly, highly concentrated. We don't see it because we see lots of different brands, but they're actually generally centralized under the heading of one big firm. A lot of smaller firms, for one reason or another, have gone under during this crisis, and as a result, the bigger firms have found themselves much, much more powerful, and that has all sorts of implications for the way that the system works. Indeed, it's a big part of the reason why the last 10 years have been so stagnant, really, why productivity, why growth has stagnated, and why we've seen kind of increasing levels of inequality is because of this trend of rising monopoly power. So that's something that's deepening over the course of the pandemic. The second thing we're seeing is a rise in state intervention, which I'm sure a lot of people have noticed. And I think it's been very interesting the way in which this has been treated, because you've seen a lot of the kind of British media getting behind this idea of the state kind of intervening more in the economy. We're hearing from everywhere that austerity is over, that, on the left, it's Jeremy Corbyn won this intellectual battle, and on the right, it's austerity went slightly too far, and Johnsonism is the kind of the synthesis of the process of kind of, extreme austerity, the pushback against that, and we've arrived at this process of kind of synthesis between those 2 points, and that's what's going to lead us through this pandemic. And really, I think both of those ways of understanding it are wrong, because what we're seeing right now is an increase in
3 minutes, please, Grace.
Cool, got it. Increase in state intervention because that's what capital needs. And I think that's really, really important to understand, that a lot of the nature of what we're seeing in terms of state spending is basically corporate welfare. And that is going to continue for as long as it's required. We're also seeing a deepening of the logic of financialisation. I think the best example of this that really captures all the dynamics that exist within that process was the GameStop saga, where we saw, basically a bunch of people who've been given big stimulus checks decide that they were going to exercise their power in the stock market by trying to take down these big hedge funds, and nearly getting there. But obviously the system kind of coalescing to protect the insiders and preventing that from being realized. And this kind of idea that really sits underneath the process of financialization is the idea that, in the global north, we have this big and extensive middle class, and that middle class can be transformed into owners and therefore be made into kind of mini capitalists who have a stake in the system. And as long as that class can be kept happy, then the system can chug along quite happily. Now, the problem is, of course, that the kind of promise that underlies that of the extension of home ownership, of rising home ownership, of constant increases in the stock market creates forms of instability that ultimately, brings the system crashing down, as we've seen many times recently. And then finally, there's the logic of empire. So we've seen the biggest outflow of capital from the global south into the global north that has ever been seen in history over the course of the pandemic. And that has centralized and concentrated power in the global economy within particularly the US, to a lesser, though not insignificant extent, China as well. And that is creating all sorts of very, very deep-seated problems for states in the global south that are finding themselves unable not only to kind of repay their debts to creditors, but actually to provide basic public services for their citizens. Now, I think the thing to come back to when we're thinking about this process of centralization is that it's easy to see this in a kind of fairly nihilistic way. So to say, you know, capitalism is this system, it has its own dynamics, and those are, you know, untouchable, basically. We're in this crisis and all these institutions are being centralized, power is being centralized, everything's being sucked up to the very top. But what's very important to remember is that all of these places are sites of struggle. They're sites of class struggle. And this is, I think, you know, the real message that the left has to bring in, because we've been kind of stuck in this this cul-de-sac for many, many years of austerity was bad because it reduced productivity and ultimately was self-defeating. So we need to increase the power of the state and then everything will be better. I think actually, you know, that really loses the central message and the central understanding of capitalism that socialist thinkers have brought throughout the centuries, which is that, you know, capitalism is a system that is premised upon the split of society into two separate classes based on a particular system of production. And the only way that that system's ever really going to be undermined is through the development of a movement based on the power of this class that has an interest in the overthrow of that system. And I think that class power is something that can be realized in all of those institutions, in the corporation, in the state, and, you know, throughout society as well. And that's really what the message of the left, I think, at this point in time needs to focus on. And I think a lot of that comes down to questions about how we obviously build working class power. You know, within corporations, that means focusing on the trade union movement. It means also kind of building class power in the streets. But I think a big thing when it comes to our orientation of this towards the states can't just be we need more state spending. I think it has to be we need to center the
wind up, please.
Cool, got it. I'm done. We need to center the voices of working people. We need to focus on the democratization of state institutions so that those voices can be centered. And at the core of that, I think, has to be the voices of the most marginalized sections of the working classes. And so I'm thinking particularly here during the pandemic, the voices of disabled people, of migrants, of those who have been the most oppressed and the most marginalized by a state that is really just oriented towards supporting the interests of capital. And I will end there. Thank you very much for keeping me to time.
Thank you so much, Grace. And I think that's a spot on point to end on. We live in a society that's racked by class antagonism, and the issue of class struggle is absolutely relevant to COVID in particular, and to all of the other things you raised. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Michael Roberts, a British economist who has worked in the City of London and many financial institutions for decades. He's written many books on economics and on the world economy, and he also writes a really excellent blog, which I would certainly recommend for everybody to follow it's called The Next Recession. So Michael will now speak for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Roy. I'm going to try and run through some charts with you because I think that will help us to understand the state of the world economy and the British economy in light of the COVID pandemic. So bear with me while I try and share those. So let me kick off by giving you a picture of where we are with the impact of the COVID pandemic on deaths around the world. This is the figures as from this morning. 108 million cases around the world, 2.4 million deaths so far. And here I have a chart of deaths per million, and this is probably the best guide to who has been hit hardest, at least in terms of casualties and mortalities around the world. And you can see, if you look on the left-hand side of the scale, that of the major capitalist economies, and certainly the biggest economies, we are right up there. That is the UK, at just over 1,700 deaths per million. And then we run down through most of Europe to Mexico, Brazil, Poland, and so on, and South Africa. The average world figure is only just over 300 deaths per million. That's because there are some large countries down here who are below the average. But in particular, we can also see some countries, including some advanced economies and also others, that have really low levels of deaths. Still have deaths, of course, but deaths per million is very low. And that's going to be important for us to analyze why that is the case. Why is the UK up here and China, New Zealand, Korea, Australia, Japan down there. And I think I want to emphasize first that as a result of the pandemic in 2020, the lockdowns, the deaths, the closure of production, of services, of trade around the world, this has ended up, according to the IMF, as the worst slump in world economy for 90 years. According to the IMF, it's the worst peacetime global contraction since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Something like over 90% of countries in the globe are in recession. And over 150 economies will remain in recession and have their level of per capita income below where it was in 2019 throughout this year. And even next year, 2022, there will still be 110 economies who have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels as measured by the average income per head in their countries. And cumulatively, there's been an output loss of $22 trillion and will be over this period from 2020 to 25 relative to where prior to the pandemic, growth would have taken the world economy. So this is a loss of resources, of income, of output, of employment, of livelihoods, lost forever over the period of 5 years as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And if you look at the global south, which is very important to do so, you can see that the poverty in the pandemic, which has now going to be increasing quite significantly. Even if you take the World Bank figures of just $1.90 per day as the poverty level, a ludicrously low figure, you can see that the blue line was where everything was heading pre-pandemic, but as a result of the pandemic, the loss of trade output and so on, poverty is going to rise back to levels that haven't been seen in the global south for the last 25 or 6 years. And that's on a level of just $1.90 a day. And as for the UK, well, we just had figures yesterday which showed that the UK fell in GDP output by 9.9%, 10% in 2020. That's the worst in the G7, worse than any other country in the top 7 economies here that are listed. And it's the worst slump in 300 years for the British economy. We haven't had a slump like that since 1709 when there was a heavy frost and agriculture was destroyed. That shows you how serious the pandemic has been in 2020. And this is probably the most important graph I want to show you, because what it reveals is that there is no trade-off between lives and livelihoods. If you look on the left-hand side of this graph, this is the cumulative increase in deaths per million. And we can see down the bottom here, in other words, near the top, in terms of deaths per million, UK, Spain, Italy, France. Over here, if we're going down the vertical axis, we can see that Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam have very low levels of deaths per million. But then look along the horizontal axis. It doesn't mean that the countries that have suppressed COVID, have controlled the virus and reduced the deaths to the minimum possible, have therefore had the worst economies. On the contrary, what has happened is those economies that have been, countries and governments that have been able to suppress COVID sufficiently, like New Zealand, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Korea, have actually been able to avoid the worst impact in 2020 in GDP growth and loss of employment. And in the case of Vietnam and China, they've actually managed to grow by the end of 2020. On the other hand, if you go to the other end of the scale, you can see massive reductions in output and employment and investment by countries that have had the highest losses in lives as a result of COVID. So there is no trade-off between lives and livelihoods. Suppressing COVID will bring about the quickest possible recovery for economies so that we can get back to the opportunity at least to get jobs back, wages back, livelihoods back. But the situation has been appalling in Britain. Workers are regularly exposed to COVID-19 through their job are more likely than any other profession to die from the virus, particularly those in low paid and low skilled work, more at risk. Over 14 million people, 1 in 5, were in poverty before the pandemic. And they're the ones that are struggling the most now as they work in precarious jobs or sectors of the economy that have been hardest hit. According to the latest survey, 4 in 5 people working in hospitality and leisure have been hit economically, 3 in 5 in construction, over half in retail, and of course, more than half of workers in hospitality and leisure saw their hours reduced or their pay reduced. This is the situation then for millions of workers and households around the country today. And whose livelihoods? Well, we can see on the left here a graph which shows the sharp rise in redundancies that are taking place during the year of the COVID, from levels of just about 200,000 in a 3-month period. Now we're up to nearly 400,000 as we came towards the end of the year. Hotels, restaurants, shops and entertainment have seen large numbers of jobs lost. And these sectors in particularly employ young people who are being made redundant at 5 times the rate they were in 2019. There are now, at the end of 2020, 2.6 million people either seeking job seekers allowance or universal credit, living off universal credit because they're searching for work. That's nearly double what it was before the pandemic started. And during this coming year of 2021, the forecasts are that unemployment is going to rise to about 2.5 or even more, 2.6 million by the middle of 2021, or about 7.5% of the working population. And that's just a conservative estimate of what's likely to happen, because even if the pandemic subsides and people start to get back into activity and get back to work, they're not going to find their jobs there. They're disappearing week by week as companies go bust or reduce their staffing and so on. And if they're forced onto basic unemployment benefit, as when the government ends its subsidies and supposed help to those who are in this position, then unemployment benefit support in the UK is the lowest in the OECD relative to average income. You can see it's way down the bottom here of the scale, and the hours are, the situation is particularly bad for the UK. Only Greece and Australia have lower unemployment rates. And it's not just for them, not just those who are out of work or being forced to go to work. Those people who've been working at home and employers have kept them on are actually working longer hours. If you look at the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that whereas the average hourly day was used to be about 8 hours a day for most economies, now as we go into 2021, in the case of the UK and the US, the average worker working from home is putting 2 hours a day more, often at their own expense on electricity, broadband and so on, to continue working for their employers. And on the other hand, those people at the top end of the scale are piling up cash. They continue to earn their money either from the stock market or from very high pay. And as a result, because we have lockdowns, they're not able to spend much of this money. They've been stacking it up and saving it. And as Grace was saying earlier, in some cases, speculating in the stock market as an alternative. So they're piling up cash. So we have a position on the left-hand side of this scale, of this graph, you can see a collapse in output in the global economy during the year of the COVID. On the other hand, a dramatic increase in the stock market on the right-hand graph here to where we are today. So in 2020, the wealth of just the 10 richest people in the world would be enough, just the increase would have been enough to pay for COVID vaccine for everyone on the planet and reverse the rise in poverty caused by the pandemic. You know who these 10 richest people are, and just the increase they've got in wealth through the increase on the stock market if we took that away in a windfall tax, if you like, we'd be in a position to meet many of the requirements that we need to help people around the world. And yet the slump grinds on. Here's a measure of global activity indexes produced by various companies like Google Mobility and Apple. You can see that the activity levels are still way down as we go into February. And the worst activity is actually in the UK. The UK has the lowest level of activity relative to pre-pandemic levels in all these major economies. Something like 50% of activity, as we're in this heavy lockdown at the moment.
3 minutes more, please, Michael.
So, and vaccines have still got some way to go. It's estimated that the global south won't see vaccines probably until 2023 under the current position. And the UK economy in this situation is in a dire place. Profitability is relatively low, apart from the very big companies that Grace was talking about. The overall position for profitability for most companies is really low. And that means that investment is very low. Look where UK investment to GDP is compared to the rest of the other major economies. It's way, way down there as a percentage of GDP. And we have a long-term problem now. We talk about long COVID in health. We're going to have a long-term problem in the economy. There's a permanent scarring. We're not going back to that little blue line you can see there, which represents the pre-pandemic trajectory. At best, we'll be crawling along below that. We won't be going back to the roaring 20s, as some argued, but actually towards the groaning 20s, because we'll be falling well short of returning to normal, as many people or many in the media and the government hope for. But let's not lose all hope, because there has been an increase, as we talked about when Roy mentioned, class struggle around the world. This is an index of social unrest by the IMF that they recently published. And you can see that blue line suggests an increase in social unrest prior to the pandemic. Then during the pandemic, we've seen a jump fall down. But now as we move into 2021, and if activity comes back, we could well be in a position where unrest will re-emerge, class struggle will re-emerge, and we'll be able to start doing something about resetting the economy. And that's why I want to finish on the final chart I want to show you. What do I mean by resetting the economy as we come out of the pandemic? We need a global plan for full employment with jobs for all and a living wage, pensions and benefits at a level which makes it possible for people to live if they cannot work. We need huge public investment in infrastructure, public services, health, education, housing, transport, and communications. Ideally, free at the point of use, which is perfectly possible. We need to invest, as we were talking in the first session, that is in investments that are in harmony with nature and the planet. In my view, the fossil fuel industry must be phased out, along with other things like tobacco and military. We need to cancel the debts of the poorest countries exploited by the multinationals around the imperialist world. Nothing's been done about the huge debts that the poorest countries are building up and have built up over previous years. They are unable to finance vaccines and all the other public health services they need. We need to end the tax havens for the rich and the powerful and introduce proper progressive taxation to reduce inequality, a point made by Diane in the first session as well, the need to get inequality down. In my view, and this is the last point, the most important one is we can do none of these things unless we have public ownership of the major financial institutions and multinationals, so that the world can be planned on a democratic basis for social objectives and not for the profits of a few owners of capital.
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot to go through there, and I was making notes of all the questions as we were going along. But I think, you know, the thing I want to say in my brief allotted time that I have is that I think the danger that we have at the moment is focusing too much on policies we might like to see, and perhaps not thinking quite enough about how those policies might be realised and how we might get to that place. And that's always been a problem that the left has had, because, you know, a lot of us are kind of very interested in the way that the economy works and about how we might be able to fix it. And there are all sorts of ideas floating around as to how we might do that. But I think the kind of distinct thing about socialist analysis is that it recognizes that, you know, capitalism isn't just a way of organizing the economy that is bad because it creates inequality, and it's bad because it's unsustainable. It's a way of constructing economic and political and all social life, actually, which is, you know, obviously kind of creates lots of different problems for people and for society as a whole, but which is fundamentally prone to problems and contradictions that generate all of the other kind of surface level issues that we're talking about here. And that really solving any one of those issues, whether we're talking about inequality, climate breakdown, you know, the nature of the pandemic, anything, requires changing the basic structure of that system. That's the difference between a kind of socialist analysis that says we need to challenge the logic of capitalism and a kind of liberal analysis that says, oh, we just need to tweak a little bit around the edges and make the system work better. The socialist would come back and say, well, actually, no, the system works exactly as it's supposed to work. It works in the interests of the people at the very top. And that's the problem. So the question we then have is, how do we challenge those interests? And that's why this question of class struggle is so central to you know, the socialist understanding of capitalism, and indeed how we move beyond it. And the question then becomes, right, so, you know, this is an abstract understanding of where we're at, where we need to get to, how do we operationalize it? I think, you know, the pandemic as a particular crisis has thrown up a lot of issues that allow us to see kind of underneath the veil, as it were, of you know, how the system works usually, and to its inner workings. And in terms of the kind of popular and populist messages that we can be pushing that potentially push forward this this movement of class struggle, there are I think some very obvious ones. Now, I've written about this recently. I think when we're conceptualizing the way in which we organize and campaign, and the way in which we build, you know, various direct actions and campaigns themselves, we need to be focusing, when we're thinking about this narrative of class struggle, on three different things. So one is kind of centering this divide within society. So a lot of people talk about this as the kind of many and the few, labor and capital. Another one is actually trying to disrupt capital accumulation. And another one is giving people a sense of their own power and agency. And actually, interestingly enough, I think the last thing is perhaps the biggest challenge that we have today, because, you know, certainly when I was on the doorstep throughout the last couple of elections, that question of how we're going to pay for it came up a lot. When you probe, people aren't actually asking, what is the economics of how we, you know, how the deficit works? They were saying, my life is like this. I'm used to the fact that my life is like this. It's quite shit, but I can't imagine it being any different. And I think that basically that is a way that a lot of people currently look at the world, and it's a way that people have really began to look at the world when we kind of lost that sense of there being an agent of the organized working class who could actually challenge capitalism, when we stopped really understanding that there was this kind of political subject that could bring about a different kind of economic model. Now we're all just here like, I'm an individual, I know the world is broken, everyone I'm around knows that the world is broken, but none of us really feel able to change it, and we can't see anyone out there who's actually going to be able to change it. So I think in all of our messaging, it has to be trying to build up that sense of agency and of power for working people, alongside centering this class divide and kind of trying to disrupt the way that the system works as a whole. And for me right now, I think one of the messages that I've been focusing on, certainly in my media interventions, and it's gone down quite well, hasn't just been saying, oh, the government needs to spend more money, because, you know, to a lot of people, the government is just, you know, political elites are just elites. They're part of the ruling class, and people don't think that they really represent their interests. I think a big question that we're seeing today is, well, how is the power of the state being used? At the moment, it's basically just being used to help big business. The Tories are spending more money, sure, but they're spending more money basically to help their mates in the private sector. I think the Labour Party and the left at the moment, if we're going to have a message that's really going to cut through that, it can't just be, oh, the government are doing all right, but let's spend a bit more money. I think it has to be, you know, this particular party and set of interests who run the state is fundamentally interlinked and intertwined with the interests of capital as a whole. They want the system to remain as it is. And the only way we're ever going to get around that is by disrupting that system and by putting the voices of working people at its very core. So I think that doesn't mean saying, oh, give us power, give us your vote, and we'll do nice things for you. It actually means saying we're going to redistribute power and actually democratize the economy, democratize the British state, bring the power of working people back into all of these institutions where power is centralized. That's the populist message, I think, for me, that the left should be proposing at this particular historical juncture.
Thank you, Grace. Great summary there. Thank you very much for all of those points that you raised. And now we bring in Michael to come back on the issues that have been raised. Over to you, Michael.
Well, let me deal with the immediate issues that people raised. Firstly, the furlough scheme. It's proposed to be ended at the end of April. The government is obviously hoping that the pandemic will have subsided, cases down, vaccines rolled out, everybody can go back to work. We don't need to keep people furloughed off. Now, it may be in the March budget. We shall see whether that policy is confirmed or whether they are forced to consider extending it further into the summer. But if they don't extend it, then what we fall back to is what they call the job support scheme, which basically offers subsidies to employers on workers' wages. Workers are supposed to go back to work, whatever the situation is, and they get the government will provide subsidy to employers to cover some of those wages. What that means, though, is way short, especially for small businesses compared to the furlough scheme. And on top of that, if that means less hours for workers when they come back, or there isn't a demand for the businesses to sell products with their workers, then we're going to be in a serious problem. Either workers are going to take a hit to their incomes because the furlough scheme is over, or small employers are as well, or both. And that is the risk that follows from the end of the furlough scheme. And then there's an even worse risk that we have no scheme at all. And everybody goes back to basically unemployment benefit, which, as you know, as I pointed out in my chart, is one of the lowest as a share of average income in the whole of the OECD, about 80, 90 pounds a week. It's nothing at all for a single person. So I think this is a big issue that zero COVID has to concentrate on, because we're saying we need to suppress this virus. You can't send people back to work if the virus has not been suppressed. That means we need an effective test and trace scheme. We need quarantining. We need proper social distancing. And we need a health service geared up to make sure that vaccine spreads. It's no silver bullet, as Diane Abbott said in the first session, but it will reduce cases over time. How is that to be financed? Well, the budget, as somebody's mentioned, is coming up in just less than a month's time, and we will see what the government has to say about it. As far as I can see, they'll be saying one or two things. They'll be saying, yes, we're going to support people, but they say things like that, but in reality, it's not going to be the case, and that they're going to be looking down the road to make tax increases, to remove all the spending they've been doing on COVID up to now and reduce that dramatically in order to, as they claim, to bring public finances under control. I think the position of any campaign, zero COVID included, is that we must say workers should not have to pay for COVID. And if the government is going to cut support for people as they come back to work, then we must oppose that. We must demand full support in those areas, and we can afford it. As one of the questioners said, there's absolutely no reason we, the government, this nation, can afford this. It can continue to spend money. It can fund that through, because interest rates are incredibly low, so we can fund it through government borrowing or through central bank financing, certainly for a considerable period ahead. And we can also reduce the useless costs on the military and other areas which the government has wasted money on from the point of view of an empire, which could be used to devote to the resources. We could also introduce a windfall tax on the richest stock market gains that have been made by the top people, to use those funds, as I said earlier, to help us with supporting the people who have been on the front line up to now in danger of virus, but also possibly others coming into that if the furlough scheme disappears. So that's the sort of thing I think we should be fighting for in the budget. And we have to emphasize, that seems to me in Zero COVID campaign, that there is no trade-off between lives and livelihoods. The argument that everybody has to get back to work, whatever happens to the virus, that's the only way to get the economy going, is totally wrong. I showed it in the charts. It's not true. Those countries that have suppressed the virus properly, with all the methods that are available to health systems and so on, have been able to get their economies going quicker. The countries and governments that have failed to do that, like the UK, have been left with huge death rates and the worst economy in 2020 in the whole of the G7. And that will continue this year unless we recognize the need to suppress the virus with all the methods available, not just vaccines, but all the other methods. And if that means people are not able to go back to work for some time, then we need to give them full support. We need the money to be put in to support people either on furlough schemes or in other ways of ensuring. Does that mean a universal basic income? Well, it's certainly an idea. I have no objection to the idea, at least for a while. But I think longer term, what we need is to reset the economy, not in the way of just making handouts to people so they're able to work or not, but to move towards where basic public services or basic services become public and they're properly financed. We need, in my view, not universal basic income so much, but universal basic services in health, in education, in transport, as somebody mentioned. We need to rejig that in the direction of publicly owned, publicly funded operations, which are brought into a plan that's the interest of society as a whole. Finally, what we need when we're dealing with do we need growth or not growth, what we need is a social economy. We need an economy which organizes the production resources of the world and the funding available to that in the direction of social needs of people, and that includes humanity's connection with nature and the planet. Those two things must go together. I said in my presentation, we need to end all this unbelievably grotesque spending on fossil fuels, on timber exploitation, on mineral exploration, and so on. We need to bring that in a way in which it harmonizes with nature. That means a global plan, as far as I'm concerned. But even in Britain, we need to start to move in the direction where it's not so much of no growth or growth. It is what sort of growth? What sort of growth will be in the interests of people's needs and of nature? And can we harmonize that? I think we can. That's the sort of program we need. It applies the same to the National Health Service. They're going to centralize the National Health Service because they realized what they did before was an absolute disaster in COVID. But their talk of centralization is to put it in the hands of Matt Hancock and a few other guys to consider privatization and contracting out. What we need is not so much centralization or decentralization. We need to return to the basic principles of the National Health Service, that it is health provided, services provided at the point of use free, funded by the taxpayer and the government in general, and organized democratically. I remember, I'm an old man, I remember the democratic organizations we used to have for medical at a regional and local level, for consumers and health people. All that was wiped out in the last 20 or 30 years. We need to move back to a democratic National Health Service, publicly owned, publicly financed, where everybody is directly working for the NHS and not contracted out into all kinds of agencies, so that we can direct our resources in the interest of people and not in the interest of the profit of a few.